Just one quick announcement and then a very quick introduction of Dr. Gastel. We are fortunate enough to have her come back in 2 weeks to do another webinar for us. 2 weeks from today, June 18th, 11 a.m., same time. She's going to focus on being an excellent peer reviewer. I've sent out, I think yesterday I sent out emails about that, and hopefully y'all received those either directly from me or from someone in your on your department or the VPR's office. So make sure to register for that. We just like to know, kind of have an idea how many people are gonna join us, and I'll send you a reminder, and you'll also get the presentation slides and the link to the YouTube video afterwards. So just make sure you register. Even if you can't make it, but you're interested in receiving the link afterwards, just register so that you'll get that email. And then I'm just gonna do a very quick introduction of Dr. Gastel. For those of you who don't know her, Dr. Gastel got her BA from Yale and her MD and MPH from Johns Hopkins. She's a physician who specializes in writing and editing. She's a professor of integrated biosciences, humanities and medicine, and also biotechnology. And she runs the master's degree program in science and technology journalism at the College of Veterinary Medicine. She also has a lot more that I'm not mentioning now, but I know a lot of you know her, and we have a lot to get covered today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm glad to be here, glad to see some familiar names and faces, and also some new people. And Stacy, can you see my screen? Is it coming up with my slides?
Yeah. Yes, I can, and I just want to mention for those who, I forgot to mention for those who just joined us, that I am monitoring the chat. If you have a question that relates to something that Barbara's talking about at the time, just put a question in the chat and I will relay that to her. We'll also have some time at the end for questions, but since we have so many people registered for this webinar, we're just gonna, if you could just put those in the chat and then I will relay those to her.
Great, thank you very much. So welcome for this session on writing an excellent review article on both scholarship and service. And those of you who've been to my webinars and talks before know that I like to break up the text with some photos. And I thought for this one, I thought it'd be nice to have some photos of Sri Lanka, in part because I gave a workshop on review articles there a few years ago, and these photos are from then and from some other times to give a little visual interest. So at this session, I'll first introduce the point that review articles are both scholarship and service. Coming from somewhat of a journalism background, we'll talk about some of the 5 W's. The main part of this talk will be on the H's of review articles, how to write and publish review articles. I will touch on some resources for those of you who'd like more, have a brief recap, and then questions and answers. And again, Stacy will be monitoring questions, and so if some questions come up that are directly applicable to what I'm talking about at the time, I'll ask her to ask them then. Otherwise, we'll save the questions for the end. So another view, the earlier view was inland and sort of the highland, and this was on the coast. So review articles, I guess I would contend that they are both scholarship and service, and I guess sort of teaching too. Clearly, they're not a source of primary data, let's say data from new experiments that you do, but I would contend that they can be very important contributions to scholarship and really contribute to the field and help advance the field. And just like primary research, they require many of the same things: sound, valid information gathering, critical thinking, analysis, insight, appropriate crafting, and I would say even sometimes some creativity, for example, in the way that one searches or the way one presents the information. And I know in sort of the education field, one talks about different categories of scholarship, and primary research would be considered scholarship of discovery. Review articles sometimes are called scholarship of integration. And I review articles can be a service to others, but they can be a service to you as an author as well. And let me mention some let's see, I think there's someone shuffling some paper. So if there's someone who hasn't muted the microphone, might want to mute your microphone. So I think review articles can help others in a number of ways. They can help people to identify the best literature and the most relevant literature. And they also can help people extract the most useful information from the literature. Often it's sort of buried or need integration to identify it. Let's see, there's still some sort of rustling in the background. If there is someone who hasn't had muted the microphone, please do so. I think that review articles can especially assist a number of things. One is if there are fields in which there's lots of publication, this can help people to identify, what is really relevant. Also, review articles can be very helpful to students who are starting to review a field. Perhaps some of you looking back to your student days, or if you're a student right now, can relate to that. They can be helpful to researchers who are either changing the focus of the research or maybe expanding their focus, moving into maybe an interdisciplinary area. And they also can be helpful to practitioners wanting to apply the research. And this can be especially relevant in a field such as a medical field, where there may be clinicians who want to read about the research. So the major service to others, I'm trying to see, and maybe Stacy, you could look and see if there's someone who doesn't have a microphone muted, because there
are three, it looks like 3 people who do not have their mics muted, and I have it's like 2 now. I have sent the messages privately.
Okay,
I can't mute everyone because I'm not the host any longer, but you should be able to mute everyone.
Okay, let's see if I can mute all. I think the rustling has stopped, so I think we're okay. And if not, we will go back and see. So review article.
We still have one person who has not muted their mic. So.
Okay, and I think that's where the rustling is coming from. Let's see if I can identify the person, or if there is a mute all kind of thing. I probably, let's see, under more, let's see if there is a mute all. I think it's quiet now. Oops, no, there goes again. Let me, I apologize. Let me sort of expand my window where I can see people more and see if I can identify the person who still needs to be muted. Yes, I think I have identified that person. Okay, good. So now
Yep, good.
I apologize for the interruption, but this I think will make it a little easier for everyone to listen. I guess I would also say that review articles can be a service to yourself as well in a number of ways. One is they can help you master the literature, you know, by going through it carefully, knowing what's what, and also who's who in the field by sort of seeing the pattern of who's publishing and what their work is like. If you're in the field, you're probably pretty familiar with this, but you can become more familiar. It can be doing a review article can be a great way to gain research ideas, for example, by identifying gaps in the literature. It's a great way to build a foundation for writing research proposals, scientific papers, book chapters, books, all kinds of other things, because you've got, you know, this base in the literature. If you're going to be doing teaching, if you've done a review article on a topic, you're well ahead in your teaching. Obviously, you're gaining a publication. Quite likely, you'll get multiple citations too. Review articles tend to be pretty heavily cited. And also, a review article is a great way to become visible in your field and gain credibility. So I think a lot of benefits of doing a review article. And this picture of me, I thought, for a service to yourself might be appropriate. This was when I arrived to give the workshop. They had a coconut waiting for me. Delicious, refreshing drink. And some of you know Sri Lanka, lots of elephants, and got to visit an elephant orphanage. So now between the next parts, we'll have elephants proceeding. So first of all, what in general is a review article? And I think anyone who's at the level, if you're coming to this, you're probably pretty familiar with review articles, but sometimes people will mix them up with book reviews or something like that. So in the current context, what we're talking about with a review article is an article that brings together the research literature on a given question or topic. So it brings it together, but it should more than summarize. If it was just summarizing, then maybe it'd be just an annotated bibliography or something. And as we'll talk about later, in doing a review article, you should be selecting and evaluating, integrating, analyzing, synthesizing, so that really the whole is worth more than just the parts. And where do review articles appear? You've probably seen them a variety of places. There's some journals that really specialize in review articles. They may have review in their title, and they consist solely or almost solely of review articles. There are also many journals that contain mainly reports of original research, also contain review articles. But that's something that one needs to check, because there are some journals that do not publish any review articles. And then sometimes there are reviews elsewhere. They can be, you know, on freestanding websites. Also, if you're asked to do a book chapter, very often a book chapter is essentially a review article, and there's largely the same process. How about when are good times to write review articles? One, obviously, is if you are invited to write a review article, and that is generally considered an honor. Usually, the invitations come to people who are pretty established in the field, pretty well known. And I think normally it's something to be accepted, but I think only accepted only if it's feasible to do a good job. There are times when someone just doesn't have time to do a good job or meet the deadline. One can negotiate the deadline, but I think making sure that if one's going to do a review article, have the time, because as I see it, a review article is really a big responsibility, because people are really depending on you to bring together the literature and make sense of it. Another time is maybe someone's invited to write a review article and asks you to collaborate. And I think for postdocs and graduate students, that may be a fairly common case. Maybe you are working, maybe your PI is a very prominent researcher in the field, is invited to do a review article and ask you to collaborate. And you may end up doing a lot of the legwork and then being a co-author. And I think that can be a really good situation. Another time is maybe you have a question and you realize that it might best be answered by reviewing the literature. And so that can turn into a published literature. Maybe you're reviewing the literature anyway for other purposes. Let's say it's a requirement for, of course, for your dissertation, but also maybe you're doing a fellowship that includes doing the literature review. You may be able to turn it into a publication. And also right now, it might, the next one might apply when circumstances limit, you're doing your usual research. You know, maybe because of COVID-19, you can't get into lab as much, or you can't collect the usual clinical data. Well, this may be a good time if you're pretty familiar with the literature in a field to extend your search and spend some time writing a review article. Who writes review articles? Variety, we mentioned already. Often it's recognized authorities in the field. These people have credibility. They have a breadth and depth of knowledge. They may have particular insight from being in the field for a long time. But then we talked about also more junior people on the teams of such authorities, but also other individuals or teams who have questions that literature reviews might address. And also, as we talked about, people who are already reviewing the literature for other purposes. In terms of back to the what are some types of review articles? There are many types, and I've listed a few of the main ones. One is sometimes called a narrative review article. This is the traditional review article, sort of resembling a book chapter, and it often addresses a broad topic. So, let's say a review article on, malaria or treatment of tuberculosis, something fairly broad, and then it's divided into sections for subtopics. Another type, and a type that's become, I think, quite popular in recent years, is a systematic review article, which is one that would follow a specific protocol and specify methods for how the literature was searched, how it was selected, how it was analyzed. And a systematic review article normally addresses a narrower question. Let's say, is this treatment better than that treatment? Something like that. Sort of extension of a systematic review article or something related would be a meta-analysis, which actually statistically combines data from multiple studies addressing the same question. At sort of the other end is a scoping review, which is more preliminary review, sort of taking a preliminary look at, well, what's out there. And then sometimes there are mini reviews that are sort of a brief and narrow look at the literature. And I know sometimes people seem to think, one type or another is best. And I think particularly sometimes people will say, well, systematic review articles are better than others. I guess my feeling is all of them can be good. It really depends on the purpose and, and what, the readers are wanting or needing, what's in the field. So I think there's room for a variety of types of review articles. In terms of why write review articles, we already noted review articles are a service to other people and also can benefit the author. So now there are some of the three-wheeler taxis, the tuk-tuks, and we're ready really to set off on sort of a quick review of some points on how to prepare a review article. And Stacy, this may be a good time to pause and see if there are any questions before we proceed to the tips.
I don't see any yet. Y'all let me know if you have any questions at this point before we move on.
So yeah, let me pause for a moment, and if there are any questions at this point, you can answer them.
I don't see any coming through, so.
Okay, so so then let me proceed to the tips. And again, if you have questions, feel free to type them in chat, and Stacy will be monitoring them. And so some tips, and I'm presenting them in more or less chronological fashion, starting from coming up sort of with the idea for a review article through publishing it. But actually often writing a review article is more an iterative process. So maybe going through certain steps, but so, for example, you may be gathering papers early in the process, but then later you may be checking back to see if there are new papers that would be relevant. And came across a good quote in the literature. This was a nice little article that was posted a few months ago, and person said, writing a review article is about more than seizing on an interesting topic and gathering the relevant references. And I think that's very true, and I think we will see some of them more. And so first simple tip, as for other writing projects and other research, allot ample time. A good review article, isn't something you do in a weekend. It can take, a fair amount of time to do a good review article. So schedule enough time. I think another important thing is trying to define the scope and focus of a review article. And I find this can sometimes take a fair amount of thought. And one aspect of scope and focus would be the breadth of the subject matter. For example, are you going to focus on the total topic, or is there a specific aspect of the topic? And if so, why would you want to focus on that aspect? Another part of scope and focus is defining the time period covered. For example, if there's not been another review article on the subject, you may want to cover all the research going back. But let's say it's a topic that's been around for a while, and maybe 10 years ago, there was a really good review article. Well, then maybe your review article will be mainly an update. And for the previous things, you would maybe just talk about a few highlights, refer to the previous reviews, and really focus on recent years. Another thing, if the review article won't be single authored, consider authorship early. I think when I've given talks on writing scientific papers, I've made the point, don't wait until the end and have 3 people all thinking they're first author or something. So, so consider if you've got a team working on a review article, who the authors will be, what order the authors will probably be. And this may evolve as you work on the article, and maybe some people take a bigger role or smaller role than expected, but I think it's helpful to consider it early. And also, if you have a team, allot responsibilities, who's going to be responsible for doing what. And I think it can be helpful to consider agreeing on a timeline and perhaps having regularly scheduled meetings of the team. Otherwise, I think things like review articles tend to just sort of fall by the wayside, and you realize 6 months have passed and no one's done anything. Also, I would say consider potential publication sites early. Don't write a whole review article and then try to figure out where to publish it, because different places would have different requirements, and some would be appropriate, some would be not. And so if there's a place you think might be good, check the requirements, the instructions for authors. If the journal has review articles, usually will specify it. I know this morning I was reviewing the websites of some journals that publish review articles, and they would often say how long a review article can be, how many figures or tables it can have, about how many references, those kinds of things. And that's helpful to know, and may help in deciding what would be a good publication site. And I'd say actually look at some review articles in the publication sites and see if they're the kind of review article you're envisioning writing. And I would also say consult the journal editor. This is different than usually for a scientific paper. So if it's a scientific paper reporting new research, usually you wouldn't consult the journal editor as to whether it was potentially suitable, unless maybe you think it's sort of outside the scope. You would just send it in, because normally the journal editor would say, how would I know until see the research? But for review articles, it can be really helpful to consult the journal editor. Obviously, the journal editor can't say whether they'll definitely publish it, but at least they can say whether they would consider publication, because it would be a shame to spend a lot of time doing a review article geared for a specific journal, and then for them to say, no, we're just not interested in the topic. Or sadly for them to, let's say you're halfway through writing it, and then you see the journal has published something in their interim. So the journal editor could say whether they'd consider something or not, and you can make sure you're not submitting something on the same type. Also, one of the nice things, if you consult the journal editor and the journal editor is potentially interested, the journal editor may be able to note some points to keep in mind. They might want, for example, they might say, well, I think our audience would be especially interested in this aspect of the subject, so emphasize this, but they're not very interested in that other aspect. Just keep it short about that aspect. So some guidance. They may even have guidance about figures, tables, things like that. I know, as we'll mention later, some journals for review articles, they have their artists do the final versions of the figures. So they may be able to tell you, what kind of sketch you could submit. So it can be helpful to consult the journal editor early. Obviously, search the literature thoroughly. That goes, I think, without saying. And also keep careful records of your search strategy and findings for a number of reasons. I mean, one would be obviously if you're wanting to go back and update your search. Another would be for some review articles, particularly a systematic review, you would need to state those things in the methods section of the paper. So keep careful records. Here's a big one, and I think it's really a valuable one, is to call on librarians as a resource. One of the things we are really lucky at A&M is we have very helpful medical sciences librarians and other librarians, and some of them actually are experts on systematic reviews. Margaret Foster particularly comes to mind. And librarians can really help in searching the literature. I find often they are aware of databases I'm not aware of, and so can help me extend beyond my usual PubMed search and things. Also, they are experts on search strategies, so they can be very helpful in searching the literature. More generally as a resource too, often they are experts on how to keep records of what you find, how to present it. Some of them have given presentations on doing review articles. So I would say really use librarians as a resource. They can really, really strengthen a review. Also, if there are guidelines for the type of review you're doing, access them. Some of you are probably familiar with the PRISMA guidelines. These are preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and some journals actually require that you follow these guidelines if you're doing a systematic review. And this is, whether or not the journal requires it, it can be really helpful. And for example, at this website, there's a checklist of items to include in a review article. There's flow chart you can use to show how you narrow down your search. So access guidelines. And just a little note, some of you may be familiar with the Equator Network. This is basically a website that has links to guidelines for reporting on many types of studies. A lot of them are for studies with specific designs, let's say clinical trials. Others are more general guidelines, let's say for reporting on animal research. So if you're not familiar with the Equator Network, it might be worthwhile taking a look at it. Save your articles in an organized, easily accessible way. And I think different ones of us have different systems. And again, librarians often can be helpful in providing guidance. And also record the article information in sort of a consistent, easy to access way. And here, reference management software certainly can be helpful. I think a really important point, and may be obvious, but I will mention it anyway, is to read the articles thoroughly and analytically and critically. I know I was reading one thing, and the point they made was, don't just read the abstracts. It's really not enough to read abstracts and string things together. Really, part of your service to your readers is by really thinking through the articles. And then take notes on the articles, and also take notes on comments you might wish to make about them. Save the notes in a way you can easily access them. Also, I would say really be careful to record information in a way that minimizes the likelihood of later plagiarism. I know sometimes the easiest thing is to sort of cut and paste, but then there's sometimes the risk of then thinking that this was your wording and using it, ending up plagiarizing. So I think often it's best mainly to put things in your own words in your notes, and that also means you've really thought it through. Or if you are quoting parts of it, be sure to put it in quotation marks. One thing that's sometimes helpful is color coding. If you are quoting something or cutting and pasting, put it in a different color, maybe a different typeface too, so it'll really, really stand out. And then organize your notes. And I think different people have different things. I think very often it's helpful to have a spreadsheet, and then you can sort it in different ways to organize what you're talking about. I often like color coding, let's say, for different themes, different kinds of content. Outlining programs can be helpful. And I mean, just as in writing a scientific paper on original research, organizing your material is a large part of success. And so we're getting close to talking about the writing phase. And so let me pause right now and ask Stacy, are there questions to take at this point?
Yes, we have one. In this time of COVID-19, many people in the field may be writing review articles. Are there, and there could be overlaps. How do reviewers typically decide which one to publish over the others?
Right. I think that, yeah, that's a great question, because a lot of people may be submitting review articles, and how reviewers would decide among them, or editors would decide among them. I think one thing, I mentioned earlier, consulting the author, the editor early. And so I think that can sometimes be a way of sort of establishing priority and helping that to see that it's geared. I think in terms of reviewing the review article, the reviewers and editors probably would be looking at, what value this review article adds. Things like, how thoroughly was the literature reviewed, how well is it integrated, how thoughtful of the comments, does the review identify areas for additional research. I also think they will be looking at the appropriateness for the audience, because there may be a couple of reviews on the same subject, and let's say one is geared more to researchers, another one's geared more to clinicians, and looking, well, for the readership of the journal. So I think those are some of the things that, let's say they're the journal's trying to decide, let's say, between 2 or more review articles. I think those are some of the things that would be looked for. And so now we, when ready to write, again, I would say look again at review articles in the same journal, because that can be helpful as models, and also keep consulting the instructions to authors. As we talked about, as always, consider your audience. Think, who's likely to be using this review article, and what would be helpful to them? What level should this be at for the audience? For example, if you are writing a review article that you think is going to be primarily by specialists in your research area, you may not need to include a lot in the way of definitions. If it's a more general review that you think maybe a lot of students or people just in your overall field to be reading, may need to have a lot more in the way of definitions. And then carefully consider how to organize the article, both at the macro level and at the micro level. If you're doing a systematic review, it would be similar to the IMRAD format, introduction, methods, results, and discussion. For a narrative review that's more like a book chapter, you'd probably have more choice of structure. So trying to figure out what kind of structure. Let's say it's on a clinical topic. Is it going to be on sort of, the cause, symptoms, diagnosis, treatment, prognosis, or what kind of structure would be best? And then follow an outline or the equivalent. I think for something as big as a review article, it's hard to keep the whole structure in your mind. So at least I find it's helpful to do an outline. I mean, even if it's not like with levels A, 1B, that kind of thing, but at least a list of bullet points. I know some people find it more helpful to have a concept map, but some kind of map to follow. In general, there should be a brief introduction that would let people know the review's scope, what it covers, perhaps the intended audience, and often, the rationale for the review. For example, well, why are you writing about this topic now? Have there been major advances in the last 5 years? Or what's the reason for having this review? I think a really important thing, and is to write simply and clearly in a review. Because remember, a review article is likely to have a broader audience than a scientific paper will have. You know, maybe the only people reading your full scientific paper would be, you know, a few people, you know, in your own research area. But a review article, there may be a lot of people in the general area, a lot of students. So for it to really be a service, needs to be simply and clearly written. Also consider the visual aspect as well as the writing. And here again, looking at the publication, seeing what's appropriate. Flowcharts can be really helpful, for example, in showing how you reviewed the literature. Certain types of review articles commonly have tables with information on different articles. Something else helpful, let's say your review article has a historical aspect. A timeline can be a really nice addition. For many kinds of review articles, diagrams can be helpful, photos can be helpful, perhaps maps. So consider what kind of visuals to include. And if appropriate, it can be helpful to get help from a graphic artist. I know here at A&M, there are some very, very skillful scientific illustrators. So, and there are also some very good freelance scientific illustrators. And as I mentioned, some journals actually have artists who prepare the figures for review articles. So in that case, you'd be conferring with the journal. Also, sometimes you may need permission to reproduce figures. So let's say maybe there's something that appeared in a scientific paper and would, you feel it would really add to the review article. And so if you need permission, be sure to obtain it. I think a really important point is be selective in regarding the literature to include. A review article, it shouldn't be just, you know, a catalog of everything that's ever been published on the topic. Look at the relevance, look at the quality, and be selective. I mean, if something is a bad study and it's obscure, no need to mention it. Just, you know, let it stay hidden. I think one article on this put it well: reviewing the literature isn't stamp collecting. Yeah, it's, and you may have explicit criteria, particularly if you're writing a systematic review, you'd have specific inclusion and exclusion criteria. And even for a more general review, it may be helpful to have criteria for what kinds of things would qualify for inclusion and what wouldn't. So be selective. In general, emphasize relatively recent research, but I would say don't neglect relevant early research. A common problem I've seen is ones that, you know, leave out some key research that was early, and I've even seen things where there are letters to the editor sort of noting that fact. One question might come up is that, let's say you've done research in the field. You know, is it a conflict of interest to cite your own research? What should you do? And basically, you would use the same criteria for your research as for others' research. I mean, if it's relevant, include it. If not, don't. And so don't be promotional. This is not an advertisement for your research, but don't be excessively modest, because if your research is relevant, if you leave it out, it's a disservice. And again, as one author put it, in general, review of the literature should be neither a public relations exercise nor an exercise in competitive self-denial. When you're writing, stay focused. I think there's often a temptation to go off on tangents or talking about related research, but keep focused. I found some people will even sort of tack up, you know, let's say near the computer monitor, you know, something that says the focus. So keep focused on it. And I think a really important thing is don't just catalog, integrate, analyze. It shouldn't be, just like a string of abstracts. I remember a student a number of years back came in with a draft of a review article, and most of it, was paragraphs, so-and-so did such and such. They used such and such a method. They found such and such. Next paragraph, just like it. So really combining things, often with, say, a good topic sentence, several researchers have, looked at this. 3 found, such and such. The other, using another method, found such and such. Perhaps the difference was because, so really integrating and analyzing. If appropriate, note limitations of previous research. It can be really a service to note that. But however, be tactful. This isn't the time to be, scathing. And one wording tip for saying things, I think, gently and accurately is avoiding wording like failed. Like if you say, so-and-so failed to address. Sounds, I think, very critical. It sounds like a failure. But I think you can just simply say, so-and-so did not address. And maybe at the time it wasn't a failure. Maybe there was a good reason they didn't, but just matter of fact, saying, the limitations. And if appropriate, note potential areas for future research. One of, I think, the biggest contributions can be by really looking at all the literature at once, can see where there are gaps, can see where there seem to be contradictions, and can really make a big contribution by making suggestions for future research. In general, include a brief sort of closing section, sort of stating the take-home messages from the review. And then you've got your draft, and revise it, both in terms of content and in terms of wording, and some things to consider with regard to making it easy to use. Consider the flow of ideas. Does it flow smoothly? The headings can be really helpful for guiding readers. Parallelism, let's say you may have lists, then all the things in the list should be in the same form. Overall, readability. I find often in drafts, there are a lot of sentences that are really long and hard to read. And one thing that can often make things more readable is dividing some of the sentences so it's just one main idea per sentence. And also conciseness. Drafts often are very wordy and can condense it, make it more readable and concise. I would say show the draft to some other people and revise it some more. I think usually we're so close to our own writing, it's hard to evaluate. And ideally, I would say show it to a couple kinds of people. One is show it to other experts in their field, because they can critique the content and maybe say, well, such and such is missing, or I'm not sure, your interpretation here is quite right, that kind of thing. But I'd say also try to show it to non-experts resembling potential users of the review, and see what comments they have, and particularly see, for example, if there are parts that aren't clear to them or questions they have that aren't answered. Before submitting, double check the text and references for accuracy. I think in terms of reference accuracy, citation managers are wonderful. They are not perfect, so I think you still need to go through and check. And then check the text to make sure that it really accurately represents what other papers say. I find when I'm checking my text and go back to the original papers, sometimes, I have, sort of distorted the message, and I need to go back and correct it and make it accurate. Consider having the review article edited before submission. This is not a required step, but can be helpful. And one of the questions might be, how can you find qualified people? Because it's probably just not enough to say, well, any English major can do it, something like that. I have a link to the website of the Board of Editors in the Life Sciences. And these are people who've passed a very stringent exam on editing medical and other life sciences material. The Texas A&M Writing Center has a list of people available, professional editors, and this is not an endorsement of people on the list, but they are people who are available. Also, some of you know, I teach courses in science editing, and I'm often looking for material for people to edit as their projects. And if people edit things as the projects, then the author gets the student's editing, and I also go through after the student, and they get my editing as well. And before submitting the manuscript, as with any other manuscript, double check any instructions from the journal, both the journal's posted instructions, and then if the editor has given you any specific guidance, make sure to comply. I mean, when I do this, I almost always find, at least a detail that I got wrong and should correct. And then make good use of peer reviews of the review article. Every journal I know sends peer review articles for peer review, and the feedback from the reviewers can really be helpful in strengthening the article. It's as with other peer review, sometimes it's frustrating. I think sometimes you need to set it aside for a little while, cool down, but then come back. And then I guess one nice thing is that a review article does count as a peer-reviewed publication. And then finally, celebrate publication because you've both produced valuable scholarship and provided a valuable service to your field. And so these were the flowers I got after the presentation. So reward yourself with some flowers and things. And before we move to, I think we'll have a few minutes left for questions and answers, let me mention a few resources, and also PubMed searching and other searching will yield a number of other good resources, some of which I referred to in preparing this. One nice piece is called Tips for Writing Your First Scientific Literature Review Article. This is a first-person article by someone who, while a graduate student at the University of California, San Francisco, wrote a review article in collaboration with her mentor, and it talks about her experience and has some really good tips. There's also sort of a classic article called Writing Review Article for Psychological Bulletin. It's by a professor who's done lots of reviewing, and most of the points apply to wherever you're writing a review article for. I mentioned Texas A&M University Libraries. They have part of the library websites that's a systematic review service and has lots of good material on doing systematic reviews and talks about who to contact for guidance. So recommend this. Earlier, I mentioned the PRISMA statement, which is guidelines for writing systematic reviews, and it's helpful, and some of the material in it also applies to other reviews. Also, as you may know, the National Academy of Sciences has an annual award for scientific reviewing, and what they do is they rotate fields. I think they do it like 1 year it's biological sciences, 1 year it's behavioral sciences, and one it's physical sciences. So every third year it's sort of biomedical or other biological sciences. And by looking at this list, it's a great way to identify authors who've written multiple outstanding review articles, and then when you can track down, some of them, use them as examples. And also, I've provided a link to an infographic on doing review articles. This was from the publisher Taylor and Francis, and was fairly recently posted. So for those of you who'd like more, those are a few starting points. And so to recap before questions and answers, a good review article, it's both scholarship and a service. And I hope this presentation will help you prepare review articles that achieve both goals. And so now photo of very, very nice, enticing meal that I had in Sri Lanka. And before we break for what will probably be lunch for a number of us, let me see if there are some questions.
Like we have a couple here. We have one from Sam Bell. She would like to know if there are tips on finding science illustrators at A&M.
Right, tips on finding science illustrators at A&M. I would start with the communications departments in your colleges. For example, I have joint appointments at College of Veterinary Medicine, Biomedical Sciences, and College of Medicine. And I know, for example, at the College of Veterinary Medicine, we have a very good communications office with some graphic artists there who are extremely good. And they, you know, in some cases, they would be able to do drawings. In other cases, they probably could suggest people. So that is where I would start. Also, some of you may have been to, there have been some webinars on scientific illustration by a company that does that and has a sort of a contract and has resources. And so that may be another resource.
Okay, it looks like we have one person who's asking, can you please tell us briefly what are the steps in writing a review article? So is there maybe a checklist that someone might refer to as they're writing, or
right, and I think
of some sort?
Right, and I think the steps, you could probably sort of condense the tips that I gave, because I did it almost in terms of the, the steps of, defining the scope, defining target journal, gathering the literature, analyzing the literature, writing, revising, getting feedback, submitting, re-revising. So that would be sort of basically the steps.
Okay, and we have one other question here. I think it looks like someone is interested in submitting a paper for editing for your class. And I don't know if I can provide them your email address. And
right, right. I think my email address is right on the slides, and also I'm in the directory. Probably the easiest thing is just b-gastel, Gastel, at tamu.edu. You can just email it to me, and then I will see whether there is anybody in the editing class who is interested in editing it. And as mentioned, the student will edit it, and then I'll go through and do some more editing.
And I will, when we're done here, I'll send an email to everyone who registered today with her presentation slides that includes all the links to the resources. And then we're recording the webinar as well, and I'll post that on YouTube with Barbara's permission, of course, and I'll provide that link to you as well, and I'll give you her email address in that email. So just make sure that you registered today. If you didn't, send me a quick email so that I can get that information onto you. Well, it looks like we don't have any other questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Gastel, for doing this for us today. Everyone remember to register for her webinar she's giving 2 weeks from today. If you haven't received that email from me, just let me know and I'll get you that information on how to register. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you everybody for joining me today. And thank you, Stacy, for organizing this. Really appreciate it.
And we'll see you next time.